Ethan had always been a skilled pilot, but nothing in his training could prepare him for the disaster that struck today. The spaceship shook violently as alarms blared in his ears. He tried to regain control of the ship, but it was useless. The thing was terribly wrong. The control panel was flashing warnings faster than he could read them. The ship was descending too quickly, and he had no way of stopping it. Come on, Ethan muttered, tightening his grip on the controls. But the ship continued to plummet. Through the sky, headed for an unknown planet below. The view through the small window showed nothing but darkness and the blur of stars. He could feel the pull of gravity increasing as the ship spiraled downward. The crash came suddenly, one final terrifying jolt that threw Ethan against his seat. His vision went black for a moment, and then he slowly came to. The ship had crashed, its hull torn apart, and there was a sharp pain in his leg. He could hear the faint sound of crackling flames from the wreckage around him. Great, he groaned. Looking around, the control panel was dead, and the ship's interior was filled with smoke. He had to get out. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt with a quick movement and struggled to stand. His leg throbbed with pain, but he managed to limp toward the hatch. He pushed with all his strength, and the hatch finally gave way, creaking open to reveal the barren landscape outside. He stepped out, wincing as his injured leg gave out beneath him. He caught himself on the edge of the ship and took a deep breath. The planet was cold. The ground was rocky and uneven, covered in dust. The sky above was dim, with strange clouds swirling in the distance. Ethan had no idea where he had landed, but he knew he needed to find shelter. There was no one else around, no sign of any civilization. His communication systems were down, and he had no way to contact anyone for help. Ethan scanned the area, looking for anything that could offer protection from the harsh conditions. He limped forward, his eyes searching for a sign of life, but all he saw were jagged rocks and empty desert. It felt like he was the only living thing on this barren planet. Suddenly, he heard a noise of soft rustling, followed by the sound of footsteps. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. Ethan crouched behind a large rock, his eyes narrowed. He didn't know if the person or whatever it was friend or foe, but he had to find out. Slowly, he peered around the rock, trying to get a better look. There, in the distance, was a figure. It was a woman, though her appearance was far from anything he had seen before. She was tall and slender, with pale, almost glowing skin. Her hair was long, flowing down her back in a silvery stream. And her eyes, when she turned toward him, were a deep, otherworldly shade of violet. She looked confused, and Ethan could tell that she was lost, just like him. Her clothes were tattered, and she appeared to be searching for something. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was just trying to survive. Ethan stood up carefully, making sure not to startle her. He limped toward her, his voice low and cautious. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman froze, her eyes locking with his. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she spoke in a language he didn't understand. Her voice was soft and melodic, but it was clear that she was frightened. Ethan raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm stranded here, too. I don't know where I am." The woman studied him for a moment. Longer, and then she took a step forward, her body language still tense. She was wary but not hostile. Slowly, she spoke again, this time using a few words he could make out. "Ship, crash." Ethan nodded, relieved that they were able to communicate. "Yeah, my ship crashed. I don't know where I am. Do you need help?" The woman's gaze softened slightly, though she still looked uncertain. She glanced down at his injured leg and then back at his face. "Help." "Yes," she said, almost in a whisper. Ethan motioned for her to follow him. "Hey. I'm trying to find shelter. It's freezing out here, and we don't have much time before it gets worse." Without a word, the woman began to follow him. She walked with an eerie grace, her movements fluid and effortless, as though she was more at home in this strange environment than Ethan could ever be. The cold seemed to not affect her as much as it did him. As they walked, Ethan couldn't help but glance at her from time to time. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal. Her skin seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and her eyes held a depth that made him feel both curious and uneasy. There was something about her that was different, something that felt otherworldly. They found a small cave just as the wind began to pick up, howling through the rocks. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Ethan carefully sat down, wincing as his injured leg throbbed with pain. He pulled out a small first aid kit from his bag and began tending to his injury. The woman sat across from him, watching quietly. She said nothing but seemed to be studying him, just as he was studying her. Her eyes never left his, and Ethan felt a strange sense of connection. He finished with his leg and sat back against the cave wall. It was then that he noticed how cold it really was. His teeth began to chatter, and he wrapped his arms around himself for warmth. The woman, seeing his discomfort, moved closer without a word. She sat beside him, her body warmth a welcome relief. Ethan stiffened at first, surprised by her closeness. But then, as the temperature dropped even further, he realized there was nothing wrong with her seeking warmth. Without thinking, he allowed her to rest her head on his shoulder. Her soft breath tickled his skin, and he could feel her warmth spreading through him. As the night deepened, Ethan felt his eyelids growing heavy. Despite the strange and unexpected situation, he was starting to feel a sense of comfort. Even if he couldn't fully understand it, Ethan's last thought before he drifted into a restless sleep was how strange it was that, despite everything, he wasn't alone anymore, and somehow that made him feel safe. Ethan woke to the sound of wind howling through the cave. His body was sore, but the warmth beside him was undeniable. He looked down to see the alien girl still curled up next to him. Her body radiated heat, and he couldn't help but feel both thankful and a little surprised by how natural it felt to have her there. It wasn't like anything he had ever experienced before, but in that moment, he realized that he wasn't alone. As the first light of dawn filtered through the entrance of the cave, Ethan sat up carefully, careful not to disturb the girl. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles, and then glanced at his injured leg. The pain was still there, but it wasn't as sharp as before. He reached for his first aid kit again, but the girl stirred beside him, waking up slowly. She looked up at him with those deep, violet eyes, still tired but alert. Her expression was calm, though there was a hint of confusion as she looked around the cave, her gaze settling on Ethan. She didn't speak right away, but he could sense she was trying to understand their situation. "Morning," Ethan said, softly, offering a small smile. He wasn't sure if she could understand him, but he felt the need to speak anyway. She didn't respond with words, but she gave him a slow nod. Her eyes seemed to soften, and she shifted closer to him for warmth, an action that surprised him but also reassured him. Ethan had never been the type to rely on others, but something about this alien girl made him feel like he could let his guard down, even if just a little. He'd seen all kinds of things in his time as a pilot, but nothing could prepare him for what was happening now. This strange bond they were forming was something neither of them had expected. But it was real, and Ethan was starting to realize how much he needed it. He sighed, standing up gingerly and limping toward the entrance of the cave. The cold morning air hit him immediately, and he shivered. The planet was harsh, its atmosphere thin and cold, with no sign of any other life. Ethan had no idea where they were, but he knew they needed to find food and water, or they wouldn't last long. The girl followed him, her footsteps light and graceful, as though she was used to walking in these conditions. She didn't say anything, but her presence beside him felt comforting. They didn't need words. They just understood each other in a way that was hard to explain. Ethan paused, taking in the view. The landscape was vast and barren, with rocky terrain stretching as far as the eye could see. In the distance, dark clouds gathered ominously, promising a storm. Ethan knew they couldn't stay in the cave for long. They needed to find shelter and supplies before the weather worsened. "Do you know where we can find water?" he asked, looking over at the girl. She looked back at him, then glanced around. Her eyes narrowed as if she was searching for something. After a moment, she pointed to the east, her finger tracing the horizon. Ethan followed her gaze, but he couldn't see anything. "You think there's something over there?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. The girl nodded slowly, her expression serious. She seemed to trust her instincts, and Ethan decided he had no choice but to follow her lead. They both gathered what little gear they had, and then they set off toward the east. The journey was slow. Ethan's legs still bothered him, but he managed to keep up with the girl. She moved with ease, gliding over the uneven terrain as if she was one with the planet. Her movements were fluid and graceful, and Ethan couldn't help but watch her in awe. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and despite the danger they were in, he felt strangely safe by her side as they walked. Ethan tried to make conversation, but the girl only responded with simple gestures or soft sounds that he couldn't understand. Still, he felt a strange connection with her. She wasn't like the others he had encountered in his life. There was a quiet strength about her, something that made him believe that if they worked together, they could survive whatever this planet threw at them. After a few hours of walking, they reached a small stream. The water was clear and cold, and Ethan was relieved to find it. He knelt beside it, cupping his hands to drink, and then looked up to see the girl standing a few feet away, watching him. She was looking at the water with a curious expression, but she didn't move. "Go ahead," Ethan said, motioning for her to drink. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, kneeling beside him. She scooped up some water in her hands and drank, her movements slow and cautious. Ethan noticed that she didn't seem to need to drink as much as he did, and she didn't seem to be affected by the cold the way he was. She finished quickly, wiping her hands on her clothes before standing up. Ethan did the same, feeling a little better after the drink. They both sat for a moment, catching their breath, before Ethan broke the silence. "So, what's your name?" he asked, looking at her. She didn't answer at first, her gaze distant, as if she were thinking. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice soft and musical. "Lyra," she said, her accent strange but clear. Ethan smiled. It was the first word she had said to him, and it was a good start. "I'm Ethan," he replied, nodding. They sat for a while longer, enjoying the peace of the stream, before Ethan stood up. The storm was drawing closer, and they needed to find shelter again. Lyra stood with him, her eyes focused on him with a quiet intensity. She seemed to be waiting for him to make the next move, trusting him to lead. Ethan felt a weight on his shoulders, the responsibility of keeping her safe. He wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't leave her behind. Together, they walked back into the barren landscape, the storm now just on the horizon. Ethan didn't know how long they would survive out here, but he knew that as long as they had each other, there was hope, and maybe, just maybe, they would find a way home. The storm had arrived faster than Ethan expected. Thick clouds rolled in, dark and heavy, and the wind picked up speed, howling through the rocky landscape. The temperature dropped quickly, and the once peaceful planet became a harsh, unforgiving place. Ethan and Lyra struggled against the cold, huddling close together as they moved toward the nearest shelter. They found a small cave behind a cluster of boulders, just large enough for them to fit inside and take cover from the storm inside. The cave, Ethan started a small fire with what little fuel he had. He didn't know how long it would last, but it was enough to offer some warmth against the biting cold. Lyra sat silently near the fire, her face thoughtful, her eyes distant. Ethan noticed that she had been unusually quiet since they had found the stream, and he couldn't help but wonder what was on her mind. "Lyra," he said gently, trying to break the silence. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared into the fire, her violet eyes reflecting the flames. After a moment, she finally spoke, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I'm not from here," she said, her accent still strange but clearer now. "This place, it's not my home." Ethan listened closely, his curiosity piqued. He had known that she was different, but this was the first time she had said anything about her past. He moved closer, keeping his tone calm. "Where are you from, then?" he asked. She hesitated before answering, her voice almost a whisper. "I come from a planet far from here," she said, her eyes still fixed on the fire. "A planet with many people like me, but it's gone now, destroyed by war." Ethan's heart sank as he realized the weight of her words. He had heard of wars between alien species before, But he had never imagined someone like Lyres, someone so quiet, so gentle, could be caught in such a terrible conflict. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with concern. Lyra's face darkened as she turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes filled with sadness. "My people were attacked by another species," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They destroyed everything, our cities, our homes, our lives, and then they came after me." Ethan could see the pain in her eyes, the hurt of loss and betrayal. He didn't know what to say. How could he possibly understand the depth of what she had experienced? But he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just some alien he had found stranded on a strange planet. She was someone who had lost everything, and now she was trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to take even more from her. "I had to run," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't save anyone. I couldn't stop them. So I ran, and now I'm alone." Ethan reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He didn't say anything, just offering her a silent comfort. It was clear she had been carrying this burden alone for far too long. "You're not alone anymore," Ethan said quietly. "I'm here with you." Lyra looked up at him, her violet eyes searching his face. For a moment there was a flicker of something in her gaze, hope, maybe, or relief. But then it was gone, replaced by that familiar sadness. "I don't belong here," she said softly, her voice filled with doubt. "This planet, it's so cold, and I don't know how to survive here. Not sure I can trust anyone." Ethan took a deep breath, considering her words. He understood her fear. Trust was something that wasn't easily given, especially when you had been through the kind of loss Lyra had. But he also knew that they needed to work together if they were going to make it out alive. "You don't have to trust everyone," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But you can trust me. I'll do everything I can to help you get through this." For the first time, Lyra's expression softened, and she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cave, there was a moment of calm. Ethan and Lyra sat in silence, the warmth of the fire keeping the cold at bay. Ethan couldn't help but think about how different his life had become since meeting Lyra. He was no longer just a pilot stranded on an unknown planet. He was now part of something much bigger, a journey that had brought him closer to someone who was so unlike anyone he had ever known. As the night stretched on, fire flickered and crackled, casting shadows on the walls of the cave. Ethan tried to sleep, but his mind kept racing. Couldn't stop thinking about the things Lyra had said. She had lost her entire planet. She was running from an enemy who had destroyed everything she had ever known. How was she still alive? And why had she ended up here with him? Ethan knew that he didn't have all the answers. But one thing was clear. Lyra wasn't just some alien he had stumbled across. She was someone who needed help, someone who needed protection. And Ethan wasn't about to let her down. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the planet was still as cold and barren as before. The air was thin, and the ground beneath them was rough and unforgiving. They had no choice but to keep moving forward, searching for a way off this planet before they both ran out of food and supplies. Lyra seemed more determined now, as though something had changed inside her. Shoulders were no longer slumped. With defeat, she walked beside Ethan with purpose, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something. Ethan couldn't help but admire her strength. She had been through so much, yet she still had the will to fight. And maybe, just maybe, that was what they both needed to survive. "We'll find a way," Ethan said, more to himself than to Lyra. "We'll get through this." Lyra didn't say anything, but the way she looked at him told him she agreed. They weren't alone anymore, and together they would face whatever came next. The morning sun had barely broken through the cloud cover when Ethan and Lyra decided to leave the cave. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a strange, eerie calm. The air still had a bitter chill, but the worst of the cold had passed. Ethan adjusted his pack, his injured leg still aching, but he knew they had no time to rest. The planet was unforgiving. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. "We need to find shelter and more supplies," Ethan said, looking over at Lyra. She nodded silently, her eyes scanning the rocky landscape. They had been traveling for hours, walking through rough terrain that seemed to stretch endlessly. Ethan had to rely on his instincts to keep them on track, but every so often he would glance at Lyra, wondering what was going on in her mind. She hadn't spoken much since the night in the cave, and the silence between them felt heavy. Finally, Lyra broke the silence. "There's something ahead," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. Ethan followed her gaze and saw a faint silhouette in the distance, barely visible against the gray sky. "What is it?" Ethan asked, squinting to get a better look. "It's structure," Lyra said, her tone uncertain. "I've never seen anything like it before, but it looks like something from my people." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? It could. They have stumbled upon a remnant of her civilization. It was a long shot, but the possibility filled him with a renewed sense of hope. "Let's go see," Ethan said, picking up his pace. Lyra followed closely, her movements graceful and fluid. As they approached the structure, the shape became clearer tall. Jagged tower of metal and stone, half buried in the rocky ground. It was ancient, its surface weathered and cracked by time. But there was no mistaking it. It was a piece of Lyra's past. Lyra's eyes widened as she stepped closer to the tower, her hand trembling slightly. "This is from my people," she whispered. "I never thought I would see something like this again." Ethan watched her closely, unsure of what to say. The sight of the tower seemed to stir something deep within her, something she had been trying to keep buried. She reached out and placed her hand against the cold surface of the metal, her fingers tracing the worn markings. "This tower was part of a communication network," Lyra explained, her voice quiet but steady. "It was used to send messages. Across the galaxy, messages of hope, of peace. But now," she paused, her voice faltering, "now it's just a broken relic." Ethan could see the sadness in her eyes, the weight of the past pressing down on her. Didn't know what to say. What could he say? Instead, he just placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her what little comfort he could. "We don't know that," Ethan said gently. "It might still work. There could be a way to send a message." Lyra turned to him, her expression doubtful. "But hopeful? You think so?" "I think we should try," Ethan said, his tone firm. "We can't give up." Together they moved around the base of the tower, searching for any sign of life or functioning equipment. The metal was old and rusted, but Ethan's keen eye for technology helped him spot a hatch at the base of the structure. It was small, almost hidden beneath a layer of dirt and debris, but it was there. "This could be it," Ethan said, pulling the hatch open with some effort. It creaked and groaned, but eventually it gave way, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Let's go." They descended into the tower, their footsteps echoing in the cold, empty space. The air inside was musty, and the walls were covered in strange symbols that Lyra recognized but couldn't fully translate. She walked ahead, her movements slow as she took in the sights. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a large chamber filled with old machines. Some were broken, their parts scattered across the floor, while others seemed to be untouched by time. In the center of the room stood a large console, its surface covered in dust. But it still had a faint glow emanating from the screen. Ethan moved toward it, his heart racing with excitement. "I think we've found it," he said, running his fingers across the console. The screen flickered, and after a few moments, it came to life. Lyra stood beside him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's working," she whispered. Ethan glanced at her. "Do you think it still has a signal? Can you use it to contact someone?" Lyra nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she approached the console. She tapped a few buttons, her fingers moving quickly and confidently across the controls. The screen flickered again, and then a series of symbols appeared. She studied them for a moment, then sighed. "It's not working properly," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "I can't send a message. Not like this." Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped that this would be the answer, that they would finally be able to reach someone who could help. But it seemed that the tower was just another broken piece of Lyra's past. As they stood there staring at the console, sudden noise interrupted the silence. Footsteps. Heavy, purposeful footsteps approaching the tower. Lyra froze, her eyes wide with fear. "They're here," she whispered, her voice filled with panic. "The ones who destroyed my people, they're coming." Ethan's pulse quickened. He had no idea who these enemies were, but he knew they couldn't stay. They had to leave Dash now. Without another word, Ethan grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her away from the console. "We need to get out of here now." They raced back up the stairs, their hearts pounding in their chests. Grew louder, closer. Ethan's mind raced as he searched for a way out. They couldn't fight. They weren't prepared. The only option was to run. They reached the surface just as a ship sleek and dark landed nearby. The enemies had arrived. The time to run had come. Ethan and Lyra turned and ran into the rocky landscape, their hearts racing. Behind them, the sound of the ship's engines roared, and the voices of their pursuers echoed through the wind. They weren't just running from the past now. They were running for their lives. Ethan and Lyra ran through the rocky terrain, their breath coming in ragged gasps as the sound of the ship's engines grew louder behind them. The ground beneath them was uneven and unforgiving, but they couldn't afford to slow down. The enemies chasing them were relentless, and Ethan knew that if they were caught, they wouldn't have a second chance. "We can't outrun them forever," Lyra panted, her voice strained. She was struggling to keep up, but Ethan could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to give up, not now. "I know," Ethan said, glancing over his shoulder. The ship was closing in, its dark shape cutting through the sky. He could see the figures of the soldiers inside moving around as they prepared to land. He knew they had little time, need to find cover. They ducked behind a cluster of rocks, their bodies pressed flat against the cold stone. The ship hovered above them, its engines roaring. Ethan held his breath, praying that they wouldn't be spotted. He could hear the soldiers speaking, but their words were too muffled by the wind to make out. Lyra's face was tense, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say anything. Ethan knew she was thinking the same thing he was. How had they found them so quickly? How had the enemies tracked them down? After what felt like an eternity, the ship finally landed. The soldiers stepped out, their heavy boots crunching on the rocky surface. Ethan and Lyra stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. As the soldiers walked past them, their movements quick and purposeful. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They had to move, and fast. "We need to go now," Ethan whispered, his voice urgent. Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with fear but also determination. She knew what was at stake. She didn't need to be told. Twice, Ethan led the way, moving carefully through the rocks, trying to stay as quiet as possible. They had no weapons, no defenses, just their wits and the will to survive. Ethan glanced at Lyra as they moved, noticing the way her body seemed to blend into the shadows, her movements graceful and quiet. There was something about her, something he hadn't fully understood until now. She was more than just a survivor. She was a fighter, and she had been running for her life long before they met. They reached a narrow passage between two large boulders. It's a perfect place to hide. Ethan motioned for Lyra to follow, and they squeezed through the gap, finding themselves in a small, hidden cave. It was dark, but it offered the protection they needed. They sat in silence for a moment, catching their breath. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Ethan said, his voice heavy with frustration. "They're going to keep looking for us until they find us." Lyra didn't respond right away. She was staring at the ground, her face unreadable. Ethan watched her closely, his mind racing. She had always been quiet, but now there was a distance. In her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. "I never wanted this," Lyra said suddenly, her voice low and filled with sorrow. "I never wanted to be part of a war, never wanted to lose everything." Ethan frowned, not fully understanding what she meant. "What are you talking about?" Lyra turned to him, her violet eyes filled with pain. "My people. They were peaceful once. We lived in harmony with the other species in the galaxy. But then the war came. We were attacked by the Arconi. They came to our planet, and they destroyed everything. They killed my family, my friends, and they destroyed my home." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had known that Lyra's past was filled with loss, but hearing the full truth hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't just an alien running from her enemies. She was the last of her kind, survivor of a race that had been wiped out. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice filled with sympathy. He didn't know what to say, but he knew that this was the moment when everything changed. Lyra had trusted him with her truth, and he wasn't going to let her down. "I don't want to be a weapon," Lyra continued, her voice trembling. "Never wanted to fight, but now it feels like that's all I am. A weapon they want to use to destroy even more people. I didn't ask for this. I just want to survive. I just want to find peace." Ethan reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to fight alone," he said. "We'll find a way to stop this. Together." Lyra looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of sincerity. After a long moment, she nodded. "Together," she whispered. Ethan felt a sense of relief wash over him. They weren't alone in this fight anymore. Had each other, and that was enough for now. But deep down, he knew that their journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Hours passed, and the sounds of the enemy soldiers searching for them slowly faded into the distance. The storm had returned, bringing with it a heavy downpour. But in the cave, Ethan and Lyra found a brief moment of peace. The warmth of the fire they managed to start was comforting, though the weight of what lay ahead still loomed over them. Lyra sat near the fire, her expression distant as she stared into the flames. Ethan couldn't help but watch her, his thoughts heavy with what she had shared. He had never imagined that his crash landing on this unknown planet would lead him to someone like Lyra, a girl who had lost everything, yet still had the strength to keep going. After a while, Lyra stood up, her movements slow but deliberate. She walked over to Ethan, her eyes meeting his. "I need to show you something," she said softly. Ethan looked up, curious. "What is it?" Lyra didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned and walked toward the back of the cave, where a small stone door lay hidden beneath a pile of rocks. Ethan followed her, his heart beating faster. What was she going to show him? With a few quick movements, Lyra cleared the rocks away, revealing a hidden chamber. Inside, there was a strange, glowing crystal. It pulsed with energy, casting a faint light across the walls of the cave. "This is the key," Lyra said quietly. "The key to saving my people. The key to ending the war." Ethan stood frozen for a moment, taking in the sight of the crystal. He didn't fully understand what it was, but he could feel its power. And in that moment, he realized that their journey wasn't just about survival. It was about something much bigger, something that could change the fate of the galaxy together. They were going to face the enemies that had destroyed her world. They were going to make sure that no one else would suffer the same fate. Ethan stood beside Lyra, his eyes fixed on the glowing crystal in front of them. It pulsed with a soft, steady rhythm, casting a faint light across the dark cave. He couldn't explain it, but there was something undeniably powerful about the crystal, something that felt like it held the key to the future. It's not just for Lyra, but for the entire galaxy. Lyra's face was tense, her violet eyes reflecting the glow of the crystal. She had explained to him that it was an artifact from her people, a source of energy that had once been used to protect their world. But after the war, it had been lost, forgotten in the rubble of a destroyed civilization. Hope she had to end the destruction caused by the Arcany, the enemy that had taken everything from her. "This is it," Lyra said quietly, her voice filled with both awe and sadness. "This crystal is the key to saving my people, the Arcany. They want it too. They'll stop at nothing to get their hands on it." Ethan turned to look at her. He could see the weight of the world in her eyes, the burden of responsibility that she had carried for so long. But now, there was a fire in her gaze, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. "We'll protect it," Ethan said firmly. "We won't let them take it. We'll fight if we have to." Lyra nodded, but her expression was still troubled. "I don't know how to use it," she admitted. "I don't even know if it's possible to unlock its full power, but I have to try. I can't let my people's sacrifice be in vain." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone. We'll figure it out together. We'll find a way to make it work. For a moment, Lyra just stood there, her eyes closed, as if she were trying to gather strength from his words. When she opened her eyes again, there was a new sense of determination in them. "I'm not sure where to start," she said quietly. "But I know one thing. We can't stay here much longer. The Arcani are searching for us. They won't stop until they find us, and if they do, it's over." Ethan knew she was right. They couldn't hide forever, the longer they stayed. In the cave, the more likely it was that their enemies would track them down. They had to leave, find a safe place to hide, to plan their next move. "We'll head toward the mountains," Ethan suggested. "It's the best place to lay low for now. We'll need to find shelter, food, and maybe even some allies. We can't do this alone." Lyra nodded, her expression serious. "The mountains. It sounds like a good place. It's far enough from the Arcani's search radius, and it might give us the cover we need." With a plan in mind, they gathered their belongings, the crystal safely packed in a protective case. It was heavy with meaning, and Ethan could feel its power even through the case. He had no idea what the crystal could do, but he knew one thing. It was the key to everything. As they left the cave, the world outside was still harsh and unforgiving. The sky was clouded over, the wind biting cold, and the ground beneath their feet was uneven and rocky. But Ethan didn't mind. He had Lyra by his side, and together, they could face whatever the planet tore their enemies. Through at them, the journey toward the mountains was long and difficult. The terrain was rough, and the weather seemed to grow colder the higher they climbed. But with every step, Ethan felt a sense of purpose growing inside him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something much bigger, about helping Lyra find the strength to stand up to the Arcani and reclaim her home. As they made their way through the rocky landscape, Lyra seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant. Ethan could tell she was still carrying the weight of everything that had happened to her. The destruction of her people, the loss of her home, the endless running from their enemies, it was a lot for anyone to bear. But there was a quiet strength in her that Ethan had come to admire. "You know," Ethan said after a while, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd be in a situation like this. I'm just a pilot, you know. I never imagined I'd be running for my life on some unknown planet with an alien girl who has the power to change the galaxy." Lyra looked at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I never imagined I'd be running with a human," she said softly. "But here we are." They shared a brief moment of humor, something that felt almost normal amidst the chaos. It reminded Ethan that, despite everything, they were still humans, still capable of finding hope. Even in the darkest of times, after a few more hours of travel, they reached the base of the mountain. The air was thinner here, and Ethan could feel the altitude affecting his breathing, but they couldn't stop now. They needed to keep moving. As they began to climb, the weather worsened, and soon the wind was howling, carrying with it a biting cold that made it hard to see. Ethan's breath fogged in the air, and the snow underfoot made every step feel more difficult than the last. But they pressed on, determined to reach the summit. The mountain pass was narrow, with steep cliffs on either side. It was treacherous, but it also offered them the best chance to escape the Arcani's pursuit. When they reached a sheltered spot near a ridge, they paused to rest. Lyra sat down on a large boulder, her hands trembling from the cold. Ethan moved to sit beside her, offering her what little warmth he could. "We'll be safe here for now," he said, glancing around at the snow-covered mountains. "At least until we figure out our next move." Lyra nodded, but her face was still clouded with worry. "I don't know how much longer we can stay hidden. The Arcani are relentless. It won't stop until they find us." Ethan looked at her, his resolve firm. "Then we fight. We find allies. We learn how to use that crystal, and we fight together." Lyra turned to look at him, her eyes wide. For the first time in a long while, she seemed to see something she hadn't before: hope. Together, she whispered, the weight of the words settling between them like a promise. And for the first time since they had met, Ethan felt like they might just have a chance. Together, they would face whatever came next.